most important part of prayer is just doing it, as the Nike guy says. But at the same time, you're spending your summer morning, or perhaps mornings if you're coming to the next two on Thursday and Friday. So you might as well try to become at least a novice, at least someone who can, learn a few things and knows a few things about prayer. I'm sure you do already. Okay, so again, just like last week, we're going to be live streaming this week's seminars. However, again, we're not live streaming. Again, not live streaming the Q&A portion. So the part where I'm just talking at you guys, monologue, your purgatory, that's going to be live streamed so that people online can also suffer through purgatory with you. Another name for purgatory is Pittsburgh in February, if we have anyone from Pittsburgh here. So, but then we'll get to the dialogue, which is more like heaven, right? Which is more like prayer. And that will not be live streamed. So to give you guys a little bit more freedom in your questions. Again, we have free breakfast over there. Today, it's Dunkin' Donuts and Dunkin' Coffee. I can't promise that every day, but I can promise free breakfast every day in some mode or form. So again, feel free to get up during this to get some more. I don't take it personally. I lived in Boston for 4 years, so I take it as a compliment that you would pair me up with Dunkin' Donuts, which to many Bostonians is their religion. So I don't take it personally at all. Okay. So today's talk is more specifically on the meaning and the purpose of prayer, okay? And the next two talks is more of the how instead of the why, of how to pray well. So that's Thursday and Friday. Today is the meaning, kind of the why behind why we're doing all of this, right? And that's fitting for America because we're Americans and we like to spend most of our time doing things. We're practical people. So most of this entire seminar is going to be on how to do it, right? And it's not just a joke, Prayer, you sort of learn in the school of doing it, right? And there's parameters, there's sort of a structure, or there is a structure, and I'll introduce you to that. But a lot of it is, again, just doing it and, finding God or allowing Him to find you, really, along the way. So that's that. I think that's everything logistics-wise. And I guess the last thing, so this will go at most 45 minutes, probably less in terms of me talking, and then we'll do Q&A. At the latest, it'll end at 10:30, but maybe it'll end earlier. But I hope not, because you guys have had great questions over the past week, so look forward to those. Okay, I pray thee, right? When I say that, you think of who? Shakespeare, right? It's an Old English phrase. It's more popular back then. It was used, I pray thee, for both to God, talking to God in prayer, but then also to human nobles and various people in asking a favor, of requesting something, right? So it's this Old English phrase that has this great meaning to it that goes beyond merely dialogue with God, which in itself, we won't talk about that today, is a decent apologetic for intercession of the saints and interceding for others, ourselves, who we know, who are struggling. But all that to say, I pray thee is just a common English parlance for I'm going to ask you for something, right? Or I ask you for something, okay? Now, if you're asking for something, you're asking a question, obviously. When you're asking something, you might get a no, you might get a yes, right? But this implies that what's going to happen next is not fixed, even though, you're going to be pretty sure this person's going to say something. People are full of surprises. You might get a different answer. There's always that possibility. right? So if I ask a Coke machine for a Coke, I go up to a Coke machine and do that, it won't respond, right? Don't do that. You might scandalize people, as that should. But if I go through the process of, putting in money, pressing the right buttons, etc., it will give me a Coke can, right? But there's no question, commonsensically, therein behind every question, there is, even if just slightly, the possibility that there will be a no or yes again. And so that's why we don't ask inanimate objects for things. We don't ask questions to them, right? We just act. We go through the process, right? It's a purely how question. There could be a why behind why you want something, and that's another topic. But it's not a personal question. You know you're supposed to get that thing. If the Coke machine doesn't give it over to you, you might kick it or swear at it. You might be tempted to do that. But you're not going to interrogate it, right? Send it down to the Jacksonville Police Department. You're not going to do that for further questioning. So that's because we know commonsensically that it didn't have a choice, right? Maybe the person who programmed it did, but that Coke machine itself is not morally responsible. So this free choice, put in a more philosophical way, is free will, right? So it's our uniquely human attribute that can say yes or no, even against all of our nerves, animal instincts, feelings, etc., right? Look at the sacrifice of St. Maximilian Kolbe, right? He was, going to make it out of this particular terrible Nazi condemnation of about 10 people to death in one of their death camps, and he took this father's place. He volunteered, and someone said, you're a Catholic priest, implying that he shouldn't do that, so he can act as a Catholic priest. Obviously, you have to be alive to do that. And he said, this is what priests do, right? But, if anyone has been in danger of death in this building, and I'm sure even him to some degree, everything acts against it, right? Because everyone has this desire, this instinct to preserve their life, right? But he acted against that in a greater cause, in a greater purpose, right? So, okay. So pray means to ask, right? And to ask something implies this something that you're asking it to really has to be a someone, right? So we know persons are only persons as far as an I or a subjective reality exists there, right? So and this happens with babies, right? They see themselves in the mirror, and at some point it becomes not just a part of their environment, but it becomes a me, an I, right? There's a me separate from the world, right? And if it doesn't manifest right now, if that baby can't recognize itself right now in the mirror, it will in just basically a little amount of time, relatively speaking, left to its own natural capacities and development, right? So unless there's a catastrophic events, all human beings from conception onwards are going to develop and unfold and eventually, have this capacity to see themselves as an I, separate from the environment, right? Okay, so this makes sense. If we don't have a free will, we're really distinct from the many, and we're really not distinct in that case, from the many complex things going on in the universe, right? Just a bunch of chemical reactions. If you, don't take a view of the supernatural. And free will, although conditioned and relative is the wrong word, but conditioned and contingent upon our material universe to some extent, right? It's still, in some degree, an immaterial thing, right? You can't measure free will under a microscope. And we could discuss that for another day, showing why that exists. But we don't have time right now. So we ultimately not be personal beings, right? Things that exist separate from their environment, because you can see that stars can't help but shine, you know. Flowers, if they're doing well, if they're in the right soil, getting the right amount of sunlight and water, they can't help but grow. And animals, unless they have something, you know, they got hit by another animal, or they fell on their head or something, they can't help but sustain themselves, right? That's what they do. Animals preserve their lives. So, yeah, we see that these kind of natural inclinations rule without any sort of second thought, second pause between animals, vegetables, flowers, these sorts of things, right? They can't help but do what they do. And what they do is good, but it's not human, right? Because it's not free. Okay. So it's a who we're talking to, right? That is what the Coke machine I discussed earlier. So again, this Coke machine can take our money and we can be annoyed with it, but it certainly does not have any personal features that we can engage with, right? That we can discover more about, right? And husbands and wives talk about, you know, after 50 years of marriage, they still are getting to know their spouse even more. It's almost like they don't know them as much as they thought they did originally. And this is actually not just a romanticism, but it's actually true, because a personal subject, you can't, by definition, uncover everything about them, right? And that's true, in a sense, with a human person, but, and we'll talk about this in a second, even more so if you go up the ladder, right, to God. And in fact, it's a teaching of our faith, and, you know, I'm teaching the Catholic Church here, so I can use a little inside baseball, that you can't comprehend God ever. So even in heaven, you won't be able to fully comprehend God's essence, but you will be able to sufficiently, perfectly receive it, but you can't ever fully grasp God with your mind, even when perfected in heaven. So anyway, this kind of inexhaustibility of being or personality, you know, this comes about, and we can see traces of it in human beings, but it must come from somewhere, right? Okay. So we know that, and I brought this up in the last seminar, that an effect can't be greater than the cause, right? So, yeah, like human parents, they raise human children, right? So they're equal to them, you know. This is shown throughout, you know, just basic philosophy, and even scientifically, they have the same human DNA genome, right? So although it's different, right, every single person has a different DNA sequence, at the same time, they share the same species, they share the same human chromosome, right? So what we see here is there's a certain equality that makes itself apparent in nature. But humans don't give birth, they don't raise superhumans, right? Like demigods, the Greeks would think of. You know, angels don't come about through human families, right? And angels, we talked about last week, are greater than us from a perspective of being or ontologically. So even us, you know, the greatest we can do, and human families are so great and so important, is other human beings, right? And that's equal. And so everything else we do, although, you know, some people are chosen to do great things like miracles, like St. Anthony of Padua, right? And many others have performed miracles, right? This comes about from God. And it's nothing that a human can do according to, you know, just his fallen nature, his everyday, immediate capacities and sense experience. So this goes to show and goes to point up that there's something greater here that is giving a capacity to do these things, right? And maybe you don't believe in miracles, okay? Even so, you know, we can look at human beings, right? Human beings have the capacity, the potentiality to know everything, right? This is even shown in brain studies, just from a materialistic perspective, that they could potentially comprehend everything in the universe, not every one, but everything. And so we see that human beings have this mind about them that's not merely can be boiled down to the brain and the chemical makeup within the brain. Philosophers, scientists see this, right? There's not this like one-to-one correspondence between an atom and a piece of information, right? So where's that going? Where is that? That's an important question. It points to the immateriality of the mind, right? And so part of the mind, or the mind, would be contained within the soul. And so the soul would be this immaterial principle, this life principle, acting within a human being, with the other most important part being free will, which, although not explicitly, I think I showed that we see commonsensically that some people have free will through questions, and then some things don't have free will, hence don't talk to a Coke machine. So, okay, we see that there's this immaterial reality going on, and, well, can we make this? Can we plan this immaterial reality? Can we build it? No, so it must not come from us. It must be given at some point and in some way, right? And what's immaterial is by definition greater than what's material, because what's immaterial doesn't pass away, right? It can't be killed. Okay, so that was a little bit heavy philosophy. I apologize. But, I think you can see here that, there's something greater about us than our mere chemical makeup. And what this is has to come from somewhere else, some other place. I didn't say the God of the Bible explicitly, but, maybe the Platonic realm of the forms, the God who's the first mover, as Aristotle would say, the one who creates all immaterial causes, which are greater than and in some way move or animate, bodies like us, because we're also bodies. And in fact, we are bodies in a sense. Okay, so that's sort of that. All that to say, an effect can't be greater than its cause, but certainly and a lot of atheists would agree with this too, the great capacities that a human person has with their mind and their free will, etc., it makes sense that there would be something, again, immaterial and causing, and we can see later on, even sustaining all these immaterial causes, all these souls. It's the classical Christian term for it. Okay. So an effect cannot be greater than its cause, right? So God, since we know that we are personal beings, right? We're kind of defined by our human relationships, and that's our most important thing to us, unless you're a believer, in which case God is, but even to an atheist, even to an agnostic, their human relationships, their marriages, their friendships, their siblings, etc., this is going to be the most important thing to them. And, if I was an atheist, I would agree, right? Because this immaterial stuff, or this impersonal stuff, is ultimately kind of boring. Like, you can understand it eventually over time. I'm sure someone who studied crickets or chairs for a living, if that existed, they would eventually get kind of bored with them because they're impersonal. You can know them fully. But again, like I was talking about, when it comes to even human persons, we see the trace of that inexhaustibility, of that great personhood. And so it makes sense that we see, to varying extents in various people, we're all equal, but in terms of what we do with our gifts and capacities and what we have, there's some sort of inequality there. We see that some people are more personal than others. We definitely see more people are personable, more outgoing. But even at the same time, we see that people are able to look at you and know you and ask you questions and hear you and listen in a way that makes your soul heard, uncovered, perfectly seen, for all its brokenness, and goodness too. And so we know those conversations when we see them. And we see when a person is truly free to be able to do that, to be able to get to know someone personally in the most true sense. Okay, so we see that this gift and this capacity exists in varying ways in human beings. So if you can imagine the most personable person, maybe you want to imagine maybe someone you haven't interacted with, but you've seen like TV clips of, like Mother Teresa, right? You've seen the look in her eyes, a living saint at the time. And you see that she truly loves, right? She has this innocence, this joy, those wrinkles that were smile wrinkles in the middle of Calcutta, which was a very, very poor place. Not a Christian place at all. But still, she had the joy of the Lord, we would say. And she was made more personable and personal because of it, right? And so we see this capacity even in its effects, like the smile wrinkles of Mother Teresa. Okay, so how much so, right? Because Mother Teresa didn't will that. Anyone who's willing to be perfect cannot do it, just experientially, and it's actually condemned from a, again, insider baseball perspective, as something you can't do, and it's called Pelagianism. So anyway, we don't think that can happen, so it must come from somewhere else, not merely from yourself, right? So again, the cause cannot be beaten by its effects. And so we would say God is super personal, right? And so we would say that in traditional Catholic theology, and I won't get into this because this is a separate 12 lectures, but the Blessed Trinity, right? God loves himself so much, in the correct use of the term, that he produces, the actual term that's best in English is begets another person, right? Who's also God. And then their love begets, or the proper English term would be spirates, the Holy Spirit, who's also God, right? So imagine being so personal that your love creates another person, right? That's human marriage, right? That's human family. But to a 10,000 times extent, and that's what you have in the Godhead, right? Okay. And we know that very well. This is kind of a separate talk, but worthy of reflection or prayer about or on. But because of the fall, which was not a good thing, right? The story of Genesis, the book of Genesis, is mostly a loss. It's a mediocre season for the human family. Missed the playoffs by 20 games, and we'll have a high draft pick. But at the end of it, though, we see traces, signs of the Messiah, especially in Abraham being willing to sacrifice his son. And we can get into that. We can talk about that maybe during the Q&A or at some other point, reconciling especially Old Testament difficulties. But we see that this love of God is better, in some sense, shown in broken humanity. Because, as I talked about last week, the easy way, and as the gospel reading said today, is going to be the sinful way, the wide gate, right? And so God is giving us a chance, just as he did perfectly, to go uphill, right? To go against the grain and intentional towards what he wants as Father, right? So that's what a father does. We don't have a grandfather in heaven. We have a Father in heaven. He allows us to show that we truly love him, but he never leaves us during that, right? And that's where, us as Catholics, the Eucharist comes in so importantly, and also prayer, right? And so, yeah, you can say, just like in the Psalms, "Oh, happy faults," that we saw how much God loved us, right? That he would die on a cross for us and let his son die on a cross. Because if you're a parent, that would hurt more than actually going through it yourself, right? Or you would rather do it. Okay, that was a little bit of a side note, but I think worth touching on. Okay, so we see how much God is personal in the Trinity, and even more so I think you can see it in the sacrifice upon the cross, right? That's so much love and freedom to actually do what was necessary or what was best for human beings, right? Even though it went against all sorts of, again, animal instincts, everything that cried out, that made him sweat blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Okay, so that's what it means to be super personal. It means to be super free in the right use of the term, to be able to do the good. Okay. So, okay, we talked about that God is going to be super personal, right? So where does prayer come in here, right? So God is super personal, and Aristotle famously talked about, God as the first cause, and he talked about God not being able to enter into relationship with us, or he I think he phrased it the other way inversely. We can't enter into relationship with God because our ontological, just a fancy word for how we are relative to, God is like an ant to us. So that's like God trying to enter into relationship with us is like us trying to enter into relationship with an ant, right? I mean, I guess you can keep one of those forms, but again, as we talked about, you can comprehend the ants, everything they do eventually, and eventually it gets boring, right? Because they're impersonal. That's the way we would describe them accurately. And so, at the end of the day, we have a problem here. We have kind of too big of a gap, okay? So there's nothing, again, like we talked about with Pelagianism, there's nothing we can do to bridge this gap, right? No matter how much you will it, no matter how much you fight for it, the one who created, and we have proofs for this, created the universe, who governs the universe, etc. Us to will and to command him to enter into relationship with him is kind of foolish, and especially with our human brokenness. I sympathize with Mr. Aristotle that it's kind of like an ant commanding a human being to go find some grapes for him, right? I'm not going to do that. I don't know about you. But, so anyway, you do have a problem here, and I think it's articulated well by Aristotle. But Aristotle didn't have revelation, right? So Aristotle was a good philosopher, but he came 400 years before Jesus. He was not a Jew. I don't even think he knew about the Jews. And he just knew, just like his teacher Plato, just like Socrates, his intellectual grandpa. Socrates is all of our intellectual grandpas in the West, so congrats. But what we have here is Aristotle knowing through basic philosophy that gods like Zeus, Bacchus, all these sorts of gods didn't actually exist, right? That was a figment of people's imaginations at best. And he knew that God was the first cause of the universe, who sustains the universe. But he knew that he was infinitely greater than us, almost, and we couldn't really, or he hasn't really revealed himself, which is true. All these things are true. And so that's where revelation comes in, right? That's where the God of the Bible comes in. I talked about inside baseball already in last week, so even if you're not Catholic, you can learn a little something about what we believe. And then also, I would say, preaching to the choir is a legitimate enterprise. Jesus did it. St. Francis did it. St. Anthony did it. These were great saints. St. Catherine, too, to the Pope. And so they talk from a Catholic perspective to Catholics. So it can build people up. And so, that's what we'll be doing from here on out. Okay, so let's talk about the meaning of prayer, right? So there's this huge gap. Prayer's the bridge, prayer's the stopgap that fills that gap, right? Okay. So lots on prayer, lots of writing on prayer. Now, what is prayer? Well, there's a story from the Bible in Genesis as well, which is mostly a loss, but even the Cleveland Browns win games sometimes. Sorry for any Browns fans. Also the Jaguars, since I suffer with you all. They even win some games, you know. They come out on top sometimes. And in this case, Jacob, or Israel, the son of Isaac, won a game, big game, in the cave at, forgetting the location, sorry, but he had a vision of all these angels, and they were coming down upon a ladder, right? And he was mesmerized by this. And he said, God is truly here in this cave. And so I think he worships God in there, and they set up a shrine of some sort that existed, I think, for as long as it could before the Mosaic Covenant, which really restricted worship because the Israelites they basically were into too much. They basically had a Woodstock, and so they had to restrict the worship. But this place was a place of worship because of what happened. And what happened was this vision showed, and later theologians notice, where we find the New Testament and the Old, what it's showing to us is that these angels come down upon Jacob's head. And he's not the one who's climbing the ladder, right? Isn't the ladder to climb? But he doesn't do that. And, you know, he's probably told by God, or these angels. Angels just mean messengers. They're just immaterial personalities. They don't have any matter, but they have wills and minds. And so they're coming down. And so what are they doing? Again, as their title suggests, they're bringing down God's message to us. They're doing all the work. So they're climbing down a ladder. It seems like the opposite of what they should do. But in reality, because of our brokenness, because of our fallenness, we can't climb that ladder ourselves. And so God, who loves us, as I talked about with his only son dying for us, right? He's the one who takes the team on his back, right? He's the one who does everything to be able to enter into communication with us. And yes, it is a dialogue, right? As I joked about in the very beginning. And we'll talk about how that works Thursday and Friday. But at the same time, any sort of initial movement and subsequently, when we start praying, when we get into a routine of prayer, right, any sort of inclination to pray comes as a grace. And what does grace mean? It means a gift from God, right? It means a created good thing that God gives to us, right? So again, as the definition suggests, it's from God, right? You can even think about it in terms of your everyday experience, right? You know when it's you trying to think about something, trying to concentrate, you know, I like a very specific task that doesn't, so to speak, really require any divine assistance, right? Like, just like how am I going to back out of this parking lot? How am I going to, or like what do I need for my grocery shopping? These sorts of specific tasks. But those other things that just like pop into your mind, right? I need to pray for this person. I should reach out to that friend who's been struggling. It just kind of comes in out of nowhere, right? And so this is like grace. It hits you like a bus. And, if you get hit by a bus, which I don't recommend, you don't really have to do anything, though, so to speak. Just not pay attention and be in the middle of the road. The bus does all the work for you. Again, not promoting that. That was kind of a subpar analogy, but I think you get the analogy. So someone else is doing all the work for us when it comes to, especially when it comes to God communicating with us in prayer. Okay. So I pray thee, bringing it back, that whole question, that whole thought process, that whole sustained routine and sustained relationship with God, that actually starts and continues because of the grace, because of these angels coming down. And that's another talk, but God likes to use other people to work and communicate for him, not because he's a tyrant, but because he wants to build up those people like angels. And angels, again, are personalities, we could talk about that, who just don't have bodies like us, to put it simplistically. So he's building them up. He's making them stewards of his kingdom, right? Okay. Okay, so this relationship, why should we, just in the last 5 minutes here, why should we even go for it? We see that it's at least plausible from the way I described that it could happen. And I'll describe how it could happen, again, the next 2 days. But what's the meaning behind it? Why do it? Well, on the negative side, we've all encountered Jesus in some way, I think. We're all here in St. John Paul II Church. Even if that encounter was it's kind of like, who is this guy? That's a kind of encounter, right? So in some way we've encountered Jesus, right? Jesus himself says in Revelation to the damned, put it in the negative way, that you shall depart from me because you didn't know me, to paraphrase it, right? Well, to know someone, as I talked about last week, you got to talk with them, you have to get to know them, and eventually, after you do that, just like we have the readings first, you learn to love them. Just like we have the reading, or after the readings, we have the liturgy of the Eucharist, right? Where you love the Lord. Okay, so the reason, that's the inverse, right? That's the negative. To put in the positive, right? We grow up, we learn about different loves. When you're a 1-year-old and you've had ice cream for the first time, let's just say there's a reason why people record that and put that on YouTube, right? You're infatuated with that ice cream cone. And so life goes on, you learn higher and higher loves, right? You learn the love of a family, right? Selfless love and sacrifice, driving to soccer games, basketball games, these sorts of things, right? Even when it's against, again, our animal instincts or what we want to do selfishly. So you learn about that in the family, and then at some stage you're like, all you want to do is hang out with your friends when you're a teenager, and this is the kind of love that, in some sense less important, but at the same time it's more freely entered into, right? Because you always have your family, and that's a good thing. But with friends, it's easier to, depart. And so there's more free will that's going on there in order to create the bonds of that friendship, right? So we see this kind of development of loves, this development of higher and higher things. And, you guys have probably seen a good amount of witnesses, of talks, these sorts of things. And many a times, someone has an encounter with the Lord, oftentimes in Eucharistic adoration, because there's a person there. But the key thing is they have a sense, they read something in the Bible that hits them, right? They receive a word from the Lord that says something that cuts deep or shows who they really are and what their identity is, right? So these kind of developments of loves, they grow greater and greater, right? Eventually that infatuation with that ice cream cone fades away, especially if you've been to Italy, right? And you've had gelato, and that makes it more expedient. But eventually these lose their luster, and they don't actually satisfy, although they are pleasurable for a moment always. And so eventually you find that there's someone behind all those loves, who's the foundation or the substance of that love himself. And so this person, his peace, his love, his joy, never actually, in my experience, never actually fails to satisfy, right? Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened with, laden with burdens, and I will give you rest, right? So this peace of the Lord, although not him himself, is the kind of response or effect of this great love that God gives to his children, right? And even more so, especially when we're going through storms, right? As Matthew described in his gospel last weekend, he gives us himself, even when we don't feel it. He's still in the boat, right? And so this divine human relationship, which, again, we don't do it for this, but St. Peter in the Bible says makes us participate over time, through our human process of learning how to love God as much as we can let him, we participate in the divine essence, which means, as the Easterns say it, theosis, or we become God-like, right? And again, the greatest kind of heart of God is love, we see on the cross. And so this personal relationship will get us to perfect freedom, to perfect love, right? Because we don't do things on our own. We don't perfect ourselves. Again, we've seen that, and we just talked about it. But God, speaking to us in prayer, speaking to us through different modes of prayer, especially using the Bible to depart from, we see that he wants to perfect us through his word, right? And who do we know is the word from John's gospel? It is Jesus, right? So Jesus, even though he's gone, in a sense, he ascended, he's still here in the Eucharist, and when you leave this church, he's there in your heart, right? Part of your heart's your conscience, in a sense. Part of your heart's your affections, your rhythms, what's been purified by God. Okay. So in order to get home, we need a tour guide, right? We need someone to bring us home. And it kind of feels like in this life, we're behind a car and we're chasing God in our car. We're trying to get home. We got in the GPS, etc. But it's kind of a half or a third of a true analogy where, yes, we're going after God the Father, so to speak, in our NASCAR vehicle, because sometimes it seems like life moves too fast, right? But really, God the Son is next to us. He's in the passenger seat. And really, unless we try to stop him, he's the one, just like when we're learning how to drive, I don't know, this might be a new technology, but he's got the stopping brakes, he's got the gas on his side of the passenger seat too. So he's working with you. And so I learned to drive with a driving coach. So he's working with you intimately. And when we decide to flip the steering wheel and try to crash ourselves, so to speak, when we commit mortal sin, when we love sin more than God, the Holy Spirit is right behind us in a AA vehicle, AAA vehicle, and he's trying to move us back onto the track. Okay, so wow, I know, not a crazy analogy, but you won't forget it. And so with that, I'll give it a few seconds here for the live stream, but we'll do questions in just a second here. So thank you guys for the time.